All right. Let's get this deep dive started. We're going back in time a bit. Back to 1983.
Oh, yeah.
Arcades.
Arcades. Love it.
Dragon's Lair. I mean, this game, it wasn't just a new game.
Right.
It was like, bam,
Yeah.
a whole new thing.
It was a total game changer. Visually. I mean, nothing like it had ever been seen before.
Interactive movie experience, they were saying.
Wow, yeah. Ahead of its time, for sure.
We've got a ton of stuff to look at today. Articles, stories, all about Dragon's Lair, how it came to be, what happened because of it, and people still trying to beat it 40 years later.
I can only imagine. That's commitment.
Yeah, some folks just never give up.
Well, one thing that always gets me about Dragon's Lair is just thinking about what it must have been like to see this thing for the first time.
Oh, totally.
You know, you walk into an arcade, it's 1983, everything's pixels and bleeps and bloops, right?
Pac-Man, Donkey Kong.
Exactly. And then, boom, Dragon's Lair.
Full color, moving like a cartoon.
Because of Don Bluth, ex-Disney animator, you know.
Oh, right. The guy behind all those amazing visuals?
Yeah, like stepping into a whole other world, it must have blown people's minds.
I bet it did. Speaking of mind-blowing, you know what else blew my mind?
What's that?
50 cents a play.
Whoa.
Double the price of every other game.
People must have been really drawn in.
I mean, were the graphics really that good? Like, worth paying double?
They really were something special. You got to remember, back then, most arcade games, they were simple, repetitive, you know? Dragon's Lair offered something completely different.
Yeah.
It was gorgeous, yeah, but also a whole new way to play.
It was like being in the game, being the hero.
That kind of novelty, people were happy to pay for it. I mean, it was like the future of gaming.
So it wasn't just about flashy graphics. Okay, so we've got Disney-level animation, but running on this LaserDisc thing.
LaserDisc. Cutting edge.
How did that even work? Was it just like a movie playing and you wiggle the joystick sometimes?
It was pretty clever, really. See, LaserDisc could store way more visual information than the usual arcade stuff. But to make it interactive, they used what we now call QuickTime events, QTEs for short. Like those choose-your-own-adventure books, remember?
Oh, yeah.
But instead of drawing a page, you hit a button, move the joystick at just the right moment to go to the next scene.
So you weren't really controlling Dirk directly, were you? More like reacting to what the game threw at you.
Exactly, like a super intense game of Simon Says with a dragon.
That must have been, well, a different kind of experience.
Yeah.
And maybe frustrating.
Oh, absolutely. No learning patterns or strategies like other games. Dragon's Lair was all about reflexes and timing.
If you got it right.
Dirk does something awesome, sword fighting, acrobatics, all that.
And if you got it wrong.
Well, let's just say Dirk had a lot of ways to die.
And some of them pretty funny, I hear.
Oh, yeah. The death scenes were legendary.
Someone in one of our sources described it as, like, always waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Anticipating.
Yeah, anticipation and sudden death. Sounds like a recipe for a lot of yelling at the screen.
Probably some joystick throwing, too.
Did the random scenes make it harder? Like, you couldn't just memorize what was coming next?
Oh, they definitely threw curveballs. Random scenes, some sequences were even mirrored. Kept players on their toes, always guessing.
So, you had this amazing, beautiful animation, right? But then you're constantly freaking out about pressing the right button.
It was definitely a weird mix, trying to enjoy the visuals, but also like, don't mess up, don't mess up.
Like trying to appreciate a painting while someone's yelling, left, right, jump in your ear.
Perfect analogy.
Makes you wonder if the designers ever worried about that.
Yeah.
Like maybe all the button mashing distracted from how pretty the game was.
That's a good question. It probably caused a lot of debate back then.
Right.
But remember, video games were still pretty new then. Everything was experimental.
Pushing boundaries.
Exactly. And even if it wasn't perfect, Dragon's Lair was ambitious.
It was visually stunning.
And that captured people's imaginations. A whole generation of gamers.
They were hooked, huh?
Hooked. I mean, it really did capture everyone's imagination.
It did.
And you know, this whole thing we were talking about, visuals versus gameplay.
Right.
It wasn't just a Dragon's Lair thing.
Oh,
it kind of started a bigger conversation about the future of games, you know?
Like, what are video games going to become? Are they going to be more like movies or something else entirely?
Exactly. Are we heading towards interactive cinema, or is there something different about how we experience games versus movies?
It's a question we're still asking today.
We are.
Games are getting so complex.
Oh, yeah.
The stories, the graphics, it's all blurring the lines.
Right.
But there's still something about that active participation.
Yes. That agency, that's what makes gaming unique.
Exactly. And Dragon's Lair might look simple now, but it got people thinking about these things.
For sure. It was a seed. you know?
It was.
It made people realize games could be more than just button mashing.
More than just reflexes.
Yes. They could tell stories, be visually amazing.
Make those old silent films.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Limited in some ways, but they really pioneered visual storytelling.
And that influenced everything that came after?
Dragon's Lair, in its own way, did something similar for games. Speaking of visuals, one of the sources mentioned something really interesting.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
About Princess Daphne, her design.
Okay.
Apparently, they were on a tight budget, so they couldn't afford live models for the animators.
No live model. So how'd
they used Playboy magazines.
No way. Really? Resourceful, right?
That's hilarious. And I guess pretty clever.
Talk about thinking outside the box.
They had a problem. They found a solution.
Makes you think a bit, doesn't it?
About
beauty standards back then.
Interesting point.
Or maybe they just needed good anatomy references.
Could be. Either way, it adds another layer to the whole story behind the game.
It wasn't all fancy tech and animation.
Right.
There was some real DIY spirit in there, too.
Absolutely. And speaking of DIY, the voice acting was pretty interesting, too. You know?
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it. Apart from the narrator, none of the voices were professional actors.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
So who voiced Dirk and Daphne?
Well, Dirk was actually the film editor, Dan Molina.
Wow.
And Daphne was Vera Lanfer, an animation cleanup artist.
They just happened to have the right voices.
That's it. And we're willing to give it a go.
Amazing. So this super high-tech game had this DIY voice acting going on.
It's kind of cool, right?
It really shows the passion behind it.
Yeah, they weren't just making a game, they were pouring their hearts into it.
And you can feel that passion even now, 40 years later.
Absolutely. It's not just about the tech or its place in history, it's about that spirit.
Innovation, taking risks, creating something truly unique.
Exactly. And that passion shines through.
It reminds me of, like, a favorite old record.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the one with the scratch in it.
I know what you mean.
It's annoying, but it's part of what makes it special, part of its story.
That's a great analogy. Speaking of stories, let's talk about the impact Dragon's Lair had on the arcade scene back then.
1983. Right. It was a massive hit.
Huge. People lining up to play this interactive movie, even though it cost twice as much.
But all that LaserDisc tech, that came with a price too, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. Big time.
The sources mentioned some serious technical issues.
Well, you remember, LaserDisc players, they weren't built for this kind of thing.
Constant starting and stopping.
Right. They broke down all the time. And repairs. Expensive.
I can imagine the arcade owners, you know.
Yeah.
Excited about the crowds, but also stressed about the breakdowns.
Must have been a roller coaster. High risk, high reward for sure.
But even with all that, the game made a ton of money, right?
You have no idea. Get this. Cinematronics, the company behind Dragon's Lair, they made over $32 million from the game.
Wow.
Seriously.
Seriously, that's a mountain of quarters.
So it wasn't just novelty. There was something more to it, something that really resonated with people.
There was.
But what was it? Why did Dragon's Lair have such a lasting impact? I mean, the gameplay was, let's be honest, kind of limited. That is the question, isn't it? I think it goes back to what we were talking about before, about the spectacle, the feeling of stepping into this living, breathing world.
Like a movie, but you're in it.
Exactly. Dragon's Lair gave us a peek into the future. A future where games weren't just about points or levels.
More about experiencing stories in a completely new way.
Immersive, that's the word.
It's like instead of watching a puppet show, you were suddenly transported into this fantastical world.
And even if you weren't controlling everything, you were still completely captivated.
Right.
And that feeling, that sense of wonder, it sticks with you.
It does.
Even after the game is over. That's why Dragon's Lair is still so special, even today.
It's like a first love. Even if it was a bit awkward, you still remember it fondly.
I love that analogy.
Dragon's Lair might have had its flaws, but it also had a certain charm.
It did.
A kind of innocence that you can't resist.
It was a game that dared to dream big, push boundaries.
And in doing so, it changed video games forever.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It was a game that sparked our imagination.
It made us believe that anything was possible.
And that's a powerful legacy.
You know, it's kind of funny, isn't it?
What's that?
A game that was all about quick time events.
Yeah.
Basically just reacting to prompts.
Yeah.
And yet it sparked this huge discussion about the future of, like, interactive entertainment.
It was kind of ironic, yeah. But I think that shows just how strong Dragon's Lair's vision was.
Right.
The gameplay was simple, sure, but the world they created, it felt so real, so cinematic. It made you want more, you know?
Like you're watching an action movie.
Right.
You're just itching to jump into the screen, be the hero.
Exactly. And that's what's driven games ever since, I think.
That desire to actually do stuff, not just watch.
That's it, that agency. To shape the story, make choices.
It's been a long journey, hasn't it?
It has.
From those choose-your-own-adventure books to these massive open-world games.
Trying to find that sweet spot.
Yeah, between just watching and actually being part of the story.
And Dragon's Lair, even if it wasn't true agency like we think of it now, it showed us what could be. It gave us a taste.
Right. It wasn't just about hitting the right button at the right time.
It was about the promise of something bigger, something more.
A future where games could really take you somewhere.
Exactly. Where your choices actually mattered.
And that legacy, that feeling of possibility, that's inspiring, isn't it?
Hugely inspiring for developers, for players, for everyone.
It's like Dragon's Lair planted a seed.
A seed.
And now we've got a whole forest of interactive stories growing out of it.
I love that image. And like a forest, gaming is always changing.
Right.
New branches, new directions. But even as we explore all that, we got to remember where it all started.
Appreciate those who came before.
Exactly. Who had those big dreams pave the way.
Well said. I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into Dragon's Lair.
I agree.
But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
All right, lay it on me.
Remember how we talked about that tension between the amazing visuals and the limited gameplay?
Yeah, like they were fighting each other almost.
I think that's still a challenge today for game developers.
Oh, for sure.
How do you make a game that looks incredible? A&D plays incredibly well.
Right. A game that tells a great story, A&D, lets you make real choices.
That's the dream, isn't it?
The holy grail of game design.
To find that perfect balance. But even though we haven't quite got there yet,
maybe never will.
That's what keeps things exciting.
Keeps us pushing forward.
Dragon's Lair, it was simple in some ways, flawed in others.
But it had that spark.
It imagined a future where interactive entertainment could be just as powerful as any movie or book.
And that's something worth remembering.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to our listeners, we say,
keep exploring.
Keep asking questions.
Keep pushing those boundaries.
And never underestimate the power of a good story.
Even if it comes with quick-time events and the occasional fiery dragon death.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This has been The Deep Dive. Until next time, happy gaming, everyone.